Riley Crossman was a teenager with big dreams and a love of singing and dancing. Beyond her talents, she was deeply devoted to her family, and she loved being a big sister. But just like for many teenagers, she had experienced a couple of years of rebellions, which caused her parents no end of fear and worry. But finally, in 2019, they were beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But all of that changed on the 8th of May, when Riley didn't show up at school, and no one could find a single trace of her. Riley Grace Crossman was born on the 22nd of December 2003 in Martinsburg, West Virginia. She was the first child to her parents Lance and Chantal, and they shared a happy home filled with plenty of love and laughter. In time, 2 younger brothers and a sister arrived to complete their family. Over the years, the relationship between Lance and Chantal deteriorated, and they separated. The separation was amicable, and the children were always at the centre of their decisions. They split their time between both parents' homes, and they were also very close with all of their grandparents and their wider extended family. Even before Riley could walk and talk, she loved to dance and sing. She was funny and determined, and she had one of those laughs which you could describe as infectious. She loved babies and children, and even though her siblings got on her nerves, she was always happy to help. She also had an uncanny ability to walk into a room and put others at ease. As Riley grew into her teenage years, that determination took on an edge of defiance. It was nothing more than what any other kids her age were going through, but that doesn't mean it didn't stress her parents out. Her mum lived right across the road from Riley's high school, so she spent most of her weekdays there, along with her 2 younger brothers. Chantal also had a long-term boyfriend, Andy McCauley, who lived with them. When Riley was 15, she fell in love with her classmate, Hayden. He was a gentle and reserved guy, which balanced Riley's outgoing and talkative nature. They had a lot in common, along with the added bonus that Lance and Chantal approved of their relationship too. In fact, they always commented that Hayden had a positive effect on Riley. He seemed to temper her rebellious streak, and her grades had been improving ever since they got together. By 2019, it felt like the family had turned a corner, and things were settling into a natural rhythm. The 7th of May started out just like any other day for Riley. She dragged herself out of bed and reluctantly got ready for school before crossing the road just before 8 a.m. At around 3:30 p.m, she came home to find her mum asleep on the couch. It wasn't unusual for Chantal to be sleeping in the middle of the day. As a single mum, she worked 2 jobs to provide for her family, and on that morning she hadn't been feeling well. But rather than skip a shift, she decided to come home early from her morning job so she had enough time for a nap before heading off to her second job in the afternoon. Chantal knew that when Riley came home from school, she would wake her up so that she wasn't late for work. After Chantal left, it was just Riley and her grandmother at home. Her grandma lived close by, and ever since the separation, she spent most evenings at the home watching the children so that Chantal could work. At around 7 p.m, they had dinner together before Riley went off to her bedroom and shut the door. When Chantal got home at around 10 p.m, she walked into the lounge and noticed her boyfriend was asleep on the couch. He didn't have the excuse of working 2 jobs, but it was late and he'd probably gone to sleep watching TV. All the kids were in bed and the door to Riley's bedroom was shut, which wasn't unusual. Chantal was exhausted after her double shifts and she still wasn't feeling right, so she went straight to bed. She knew she'd catch Riley and the boys in the morning before they all headed off for their days. The next morning, Chantal woke up and prepared to head off to work. She knocked on Riley's door, but there was no answer. There were no alarm bells for Chantal, as Riley often left early for school so she could hang out with her friends or her boyfriend before class started. And on that day, Chantal knew that Hayden was going on a field trip, and she figured Riley had probably gone to see him off. At 3:30 p.m, Chantal got a call from her mother to say that Riley hadn't come home from school yet. Right away, Chantal sent a message to Riley's phone, but the message didn't deliver. So she tried ringing, but the call went straight to voicemail. Another text went undelivered, before Chantal figured she must have forgotten about a dance recital or some other after-school activity. She rang her mother back and asked her to walk across the road to the school to find out where Riley was. While she waited to hear back from Riley's grandmother, Chantal left work and drove straight to the school herself. As she pulled into the parking lot, she noticed Hayden getting off the bus from his field trip. She ran over and asked if he knew where Riley was. Hayden was shocked when Chantal told him she couldn't find Riley and she hadn't come home from school. And then he told her something which made her stomach drop. He hadn't heard from Riley all day, and she hadn't come to see him before he left for the field trip, even though that's what they'd planned. Meanwhile, Riley's grandmother was searching the school for anyone who had seen her. Then a message came through from the administration to say that Riley had been marked absent for the whole day. That's when panic set in. Despite Riley's recent teenage rebellion, she had never not shown up for school, and Chantal knew that something was terribly wrong. She called 911 and filed a missing person report, and then she rang Riley's dad Lance to fill him in. Within hours of the report being filed, family, friends, and the police were combing parks, school grounds, and familiar places in the community. At the same time, the police began looking into Riley's activity on the night she was last seen. Riley's friends told the officers that they'd been chatting with her online until at least midnight. Then there was a gap, and then Riley had attempted to make a Facebook Messenger video call to Hayden at 5:40 a.m. He hadn't answered the call because he was asleep. After that, there was no activity on her phone or social media accounts. Even though Riley was just 15 at the time of her disappearance, there was no Amber Alert issued for her. That's because the authorities said they were uncertain if she had been abducted. People seemed to believe that the most likely scenario was that Riley had run away as an act of rebellion. But Chantal's gut told her that Riley had not left of her own free will. Riley couldn't drive, she didn't have money of her own, and even though she was going through a difficult phase, it was completely out of character for her to disappear. And she wouldn't have cut Hayden out of her plans anyway. Riley's room also showed that she hadn't taken any personal belongings with her. In her room were the glasses which she wore every day, lying right next to her wallet and her school bag. It was only when officers pulled back the covers of her bed that they finally agreed with Chantal's fears. On her pillows and sheets were bloodstains. The police now knew that the chances of Riley having run away of her own free will were next to zero. Everything pointed to Riley having been abducted, potentially from her own bed. Over the coming days, hundreds of searchers volunteered to help locate Riley. As the days turned into a week, the likelihood of her coming home alive became increasingly slim. At this point, agencies from Virginia, Maryland, and West Virginia had joined in the hunt, and the search had spread from urban to rural areas. As the ground search continued, officers interviewed everyone who knew Riley, starting with her family. Chantal, Lance, Riley's grandmother, Chantal's boyfriend, and Hayden were at the top of the list for the people closest to Riley. Each of them were interviewed extensively. None of what they said gave any indication that they knew where Riley was or what had led to her disappearance. Riley should have been able to trust these people with her life, but one of them was hiding something. When the interviews with family members were done, police officers spoke to Chantal's neighbours to see if they had noticed anything unusual on the night Riley went missing or the following day. This is how they got their first break in the case. One of the residents of the street had noticed a green truck parked in the driveway of Riley's home on the morning when she didn't show up for school. The truck stood out because the neighbour hadn't seen it before. He also knew that Chantal was at work that day and that Riley's grandmother didn't drive. Chantal's boyfriend, Andy, didn't have a licence, so the truck couldn't belong to him either. When officers asked Chantal about the truck, she couldn't think of any reason why it would be parked in her driveway. All that she had to add was that green was the colour of the trucks belonging to Andy's employer. There was no reason why one of their trucks would be parked on her driveway, because Andy didn't have a licence, so he wasn't able to bring a vehicle home. When officers asked Chantal more about Andy, She said he was equally as devastated about Riley going missing as she was. A couple of days after Riley was last seen, Andy posted this on his Facebook page, quote, "Doing everything I can to try and find her. I haven't slept since she's been missing, and I physically cannot sleep or function without her. I'm worse than ever right now, and I need her to be here and safe. I can't go any longer without her. I just want her with me right now. I've been worried to death, and I just need something to make me feel better, but she's the only one who can do that. I really hope you're okay, baby. Just please be safe." End quote. The officers dug a little deeper into Chantel's statement and asked her how Andy had been in the lead up to Riley's disappearance. Chantel remembered that when she came home from her second job at around 10 p.m, Andy was asleep on the couch. Something had made her look twice at her boyfriend, and she had a fleeting thought that he was only pretending to be asleep. And when she told Andy that Riley was missing, he became quite fidgety, and he'd run out of the house after telling her that he was going out to search for her. With this revelation, the investigator spoke to Andy again. According to his version of events, he last saw Riley at around 9:30 or 10 p.m. when she told him she was going to bed. Not long after that, Chantel came home, and then he went to bed. The next morning, he went to work as usual and spent the whole day there. He didn't know Riley was missing until her mother told him in the afternoon when he got home from work. Sounds pretty straightforward, except when officers spoke to Andy's colleagues to back up his alibi, they remembered the day a whole lot differently than him. On the morning that Riley disappeared, his colleagues picked Andy up from home just like usual. But on that day, he was waiting for them at the door, ready to go. This was anything but normal for Andy. Usually, he either had to be woken up, or he'd forgotten something, and they had to wait while he slowly got his things together. Most days, they would arrive at work late because he dragged his feet getting ready. They all remembered that day because they arrived to work on time, which hadn't happened in ages. And there was something else from that day that stood out. Almost as soon as the workday began, Andy came up with some weird reason to leave, and he drove off in one of the work trucks. Those same green work trucks Chantel had mentioned. He left at around 9 a.m. and didn't come back until after 2 p.m, which left 5 hours in the middle of the day unaccounted for. Investigators brought Andy back in and confronted him with what they had learned from his colleagues. He didn't seem too fazed by the question, and he offered a simple explanation for the 5 missing hours. Andy told the police that he'd gone to buy cocaine. And yet, when he was asked to give the details of the dealer, he changed his story. This time, he said he'd gone home to grab a stash of drugs, which he was going to sell to his colleague. Except that the colleague told the police that Andy had said he was leaving work to meet up with a girl. Things were looking bad for Andy. His story just didn't add up, but they were about to get infinitely worse. With the suspicion around Andy growing, it wasn't hard for the police to get a search warrant to look at the work truck which Andy had driven that day. Inside, they found a literal truckload of evidence. In the back, they found a white powdery substance similar to the texture of drywall plaster, and it was coating every surface. There were also granules of lime, as well as various construction screws scattered throughout the vehicle. A cadaver dog was brought in, and the canine immediately signalled that a deceased body had been in the truck at some point. With that confirmation, the police no longer suspected Andy was involved in Riley's disappearance. They now knew, without any doubt, that he was responsible. So where was she? Forensic technicians were brought in to comb through CCTV footage which had been captured on cameras located around Riley's home. It was no surprise when they found footage showing Andy driving the truck on the day that Riley went missing. Andy did not have a license, so he was legally not allowed to drive. But that was a minor detail compared to what else the footage showed. The truck wasn't seen at any of the locations which Andy had told them he'd gone to that day, except for Chantel's house. Instead, it showed him driving the truck to a deserted area in the North Mountain region of Berkeley County. With this new information, the ground search shifted and all resources began focusing on that area. Meanwhile, officers confronted Andy about the discrepancies between his various statements and the CCTV evidence about what he actually did that day. To recap, first of all, he'd gone to work for the whole day, then he said he'd gone to buy drugs, then he said he'd gone home to pick up a stash, and he told someone else that he was going to meet a girl. So the officers asked him to clarify exactly what he had done that day. Surprise, surprise, Andy had yet another story to tell. He admitted that yes, he had gone to the mountain, but it was to shoot up drugs. Just like every other criminal who tries this technique of admitting to one crime in order to conceal another, the cops didn't believe a word that came out of his mouth. But aside from knowing that he lied, and the cadaver dog indicating a body had been in the truck, they didn't actually have any evidence of what had happened to Riley. Which meant they had to let Andy walk free. He didn't know it then, but this would be his final taste of freedom. On the 16th of May 2019, more than 300 volunteers set out on foot to search the North Mountain region. A helicopter searched from above as they combed through the barren landscape. As the sun moved high in the sky, the ground search teams noticed buzzards hovering overhead, so they changed direction towards the area below the crowding birds. That's where they made a horrific discovery. Over an embankment and down in the scrubby underbrush, they found the remains of a female body. It was wrapped in trash bags and was in an advanced state of decomposition, but based on the clothing, officers tentatively identified the victim as 15-year-old Riley Crossman. At the scene, they also found a chalky substance which was smeared down the left side of the body. Not far from where the body was found, investigators found a couple of unique sheet metal screws which are commonly used in construction. Those screws were identical to the type found in the back of the work truck which Andy had taken the day Riley went missing, and the drywall plaster on the body matched that found in the back of the truck as well. Before Riley had even been formally identified, Andy McCauley was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Meanwhile, the autopsy on what was believed to be Riley's remains got underway. The body was barely clothed. She was wearing just a pair of unzipped shorts, no bra, and one untied shoe. The victim's underwear was also ripped. During the autopsy, the medical examiner found lime residue on the body. Lime is a chemical compound which can increase the rate of decomposition, and it's commonly found in drywall mud, as well as on construction sites. The body was in such poor condition that the identification could only be confirmed through dental records. Chantal was also asked to confirm that the clothes found on the body belonged to her daughter. When both the clothes and the dental records came back as a match, the body of 15-year-old Riley Crossman was officially identified. The identification is just one aspect of an autopsy, and investigators also needed to know her cause of death. Unfortunately, those 8 days that Riley's body spent outside exposed to the elements meant that the pathologist couldn't determine the cause of death, or whether Riley had been assaulted before she was killed. But it was obvious that she hadn't died from natural causes, and the medical examiner determined her manner of death to be a homicide. Now that Riley had been found, everyone wanted to know who had killed her and why. All eyes turned back to Andy. The investigators already knew he had driven the truck, which likely transported Riley's body to the mountains. They also had him sneaking off work for 5 hours, and they had his suspicious behaviour when Chantal told him her daughter was missing. But they knew that to secure a conviction, they were going to need more than circumstantial evidence. They needed to prove without a doubt that Andy was responsible, and there was still the unanswered question of why. They started with Andy's phone records. Unfortunately, on the morning when Riley didn't show up for school, he left his phone at the house when he went to work. This meant there was no location information from the time he left the house or when he disappeared for 5 hours. But the call data from earlier that morning paints a disturbing picture. Riley's phone made 3 separate calls in the early hours of the day Riley went missing. At 3 a.m., 3:34 a.m., and 3:52 a.m. All of those calls were to Riley's cell phone number. This was when Andy was supposedly sleeping, but he'd actually been using his phone to call his stepdaughter while she was sleeping, and he used a phone number blocker so that the calls came through from an unknown number. Later on in the day Riley went missing, Andy phoned a colleague and asked for a place to stay. According to Chantal, she and Andy weren't breaking up, so there was no reason for him to need a place to live. And the colleague that Andy had called didn't consider him a friend. He even said they didn't get along, so he was confused as to why Andy was asking him for a place to stay. Then there was the DNA evidence. There was no DNA found on Riley's body, thanks to the exposure to the elements. But there were the bloodstains from Riley's bed sheets and pillowcase. More blood splatter was also found on the inside of her bedroom door. Both samples were tested and confirmed to belong to Riley. Interestingly, the blood from the bed was mixed in with saliva, which led investigators to conclude that she had died from being smothered with her own pillow. Based on the evidence and after speaking with Riley's friends and family, investigators pieced together the events of that terrible night and Riley's horrific final moments. They already knew that Riley went to her bedroom after having dinner with her grandmother, and they knew that once her door was shut, she had chatted online with friends until around midnight. But what happened next is the stuff of nightmares. Andy did pretend to be asleep on the sofa when Chantal came home from work, all so that he could do what he was planning to do in peace. When Chantal was asleep and Riley had finished chatting with her friends, Andy crept into her bedroom. He either propositioned Riley or forced himself onto her, and she resisted and told him to leave. He did, but he waited outside her door until she fell asleep. Investigators believe the 3 phone calls were Andy calling her to see if she would answer. When he was sure she was asleep, Andy went back into Riley's room. This time there was a fight, and he struck her with enough force to cause bleeding. It's clear that there was a motive for the attack, which explained her ripped underwear. The blood splatter found on the door shows there was a violent struggle between Andy and Riley. To silence her scream, he held a pillow over her face. At some point, Riley managed to get to her phone and she tried to call her boyfriend for help. Sadly, the call went unanswered. Riley trying to make that phone call might have been what prompted Andy to murder her, or maybe he had planned that outcome all along. Either way, he smothered Riley to death and then covered her body with her own sheets. After killing her, Andy got back into bed with Chantal. He was banking on the fact that no one would go into Riley's room in the morning, and his gamble paid off. Everyone assumed that she'd left early for school that day, which gave him enough time to dispose of her body while everyone thought he was at work. At around 9:30 on the morning of the murder, Andy loaded Riley's body into the back of the truck. He drove to a rural section of Tuscarora Pike and dumped the body of his stepdaughter. He believed that no one would look there, and even if the body was found at some point in the future, the remains would be too decomposed to identify. What he didn't count on was that CCTV cameras at a school and a store would catch him during the drive. These images led searchers directly to Riley's remains. Now that officials had a motive and a fuller picture of what had happened to Riley that night, the prosecutor added concealment of a body and child abuse resulting in death to Andy's murder charges. It took 2 years for Andy's trial to start, and in September 2021, he was finally called to answer for brutally murdering a person who should have been able to trust him. Like every coward, he pleaded not guilty. Over the following week, the prosecution laid out more than 239 pieces of evidence pointing to Andy as the killer. They also had 25 witnesses testify against Andy. The officers involved in the investigation testified that he kept lying the whole time. They said the more he talked, the more obvious it became that he was their guy. But the most gripping testimony came from Riley's boyfriend Hayden. He told the court how Riley had called him in tears the night before she went missing. She told Hayden that she was scared because Andy kept coming into her room. and he told the court that this wasn't just a one-time thing, it had become a regular occurrence. She told her boyfriend that she was creeped out whenever Andy was in the house, and especially when her mother wasn't home. Her final 2 text messages to Hayden are chilling. At around midnight, Riley messaged her boyfriend, quote, "Andy is in my room, I'm scared," end quote. 12 minutes later she wrote, quote, "I'm scared, babe," end quote. The prosecution conceded that Andy might have been high on drugs at the time of the attack, but that didn't excuse him from his actions. They argued that he wanted to have relations with Riley, but she refused. When he couldn't accept the rejection of a 15-year-old, he violated her. Then he smothered her to death with a pillow to stop her from telling anyone what he had done. On the other side, the defense argued that the evidence against Andy was purely circumstantial. They claimed that the prosecution hadn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Andy had killed Riley, and that the only motive they had was his drug addiction. Seeing as there was no proof that Riley had been assaulted, there was no way they could say sexual attraction was a motive for him to murder her. They never provided an explanation for the missing 5 hours, or the CCTV which captured Andy driving out to exactly the place where Riley's body was found. Ultimately, the jury sided with the prosecution, and they found Andy guilty on all charges. Both the first-degree murder charges and child abuse resulting in death came with the potential for life sentences. At the sentencing hearing, Andy's lawyers argued that he should be able to serve his sentences concurrently, meaning both at the same time. This would make Andy eligible for parole after 15 years. Riley's family and supporters passionately opposed any possibility of parole. They argued that because Riley was only 15 years old when Andy had murdered her, he should serve the sentences one after the other. In their view, he shouldn't be eligible for parole, ever. Riley's parents both gave victim impact statements where they commented, quote, "She will forever be 15 years old to us. In 15 years, he may be eligible for parole. She only got 15 years. That's all she had. 15 years. 15. Where was the mercy when he walked into her room where she's supposed to feel safe? Where's the mercy when he attacked her? Where's the mercy when he put her in a trash bag and dumped her off the side of the road like garbage?" End quote. The judge sided with Riley's family, and Andy was given 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars. He has never admitted or expressed remorse for what he did. In the wake of Riley's murder, Chantal was unable to set foot in the home she had once shared with her bright and caring daughter. She packed up her 2 sons and moved to an undisclosed location. And in 2021, the house where the murder took place was demolished. This case has many chilling similarities to the murder of Tia Sharp 7 years earlier. If you'd like to learn about that case, click on the link above. Both victims were young girls whose lives were cruelly taken by someone who was meant to be a father figure to them. Cases like this expose a dark pattern. Men in positions of trust who are unable and unwilling to suppress their predatory impulses exploit the very children they are trusted to protect. This reminds us of an uncomfortable truth. Predators often hide in plain sight.